غرباء 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 غرباء.
How if Allah uses scientific miracles and revealed those to the Arabs back then, they wouldn't really make sense because they didn't really study science. They don't have microscopes or even anything to study science. But to me, from what I learned, what convinced the Arabs into Islam is that, into the oneness of God and everything, and into the unseen, is that I think it's mainly the linguistic miracles of the Quran, last time, during that time, they were really into poetry and how they would use poetry to diss other tribes and everything. And sometimes they would challenge the Prophet Muhammad SAW into these battles. And then the Prophet, he would counter them with ayahs from the Quran. And some of them would be, the opponents would be so wild, especially the kafirun, the kuffar, would be so wild. I think it's because how amazing and precise and structured and how out of this world the language is. That's one thing. Another thing is that it came from an illiterate man who didn't know how to read or didn't know how to write. Because let's say I want to say something, but I say it in very layman term, like this. It's not very structured. I'm stuttering. I give fillers stuff like that. But if I wrote it out in a speech form, I will be so structured and there would be no fillers or anything. And when the Prophet, he spontaneously recited the Quran, it's so structured that people believe it couldn't have come from this man. There must have been something that told this. There must have been something that they couldn't see. And so basically what I'm trying to say is, maybe it's not the scientific miracles that, it's definitely not the scientific miracles that when we say Arabs back then, is mainly the linguistic. But to me, the Quran is, what we all know, the Quran is not just meant for Arabs, it's a mercy to all men. It's not just Arabs, it's for the Chinese, the Malays, the English, the British, the Europeans, including us, average people. So, we don't understand the Quran. We don't understand Arabic. I don't understand Arabic, so the linguistic miracles cannot really work for me. But what convinced me into the truth of the Quran is the scientific miracles in it, how it proves. It talks about the water system, the rain, and how the sun and everything. That's what really convinced me into the truth of the Quran. I study science, and then I get to know that it was already mentioned in the book of Quran, and this was mentioned 1400 years ago by someone who couldn't read, couldn't write. So that's what convinced me into the wonders of God, that really is an Allah. There is something unseen. There is something more to life than just this world. So my question is, to what extent is it kufur-ish to use science as a basis of believing in the Quran, and to what extent can it actually renew or rebuild our faith? Because I think in the Quran Allah also mentions that He actually challenges sciences. He doesn't say from what I learned, the Bible, they say this one comes from this guy mentioned this guy. It's they give resources, but the Quran, Allah somehow says bring it on, come on, challenge this afada don't you think these are the signs for those who think, Allah actually challenges the kuffar to prove the Quran wrong, and so far there has been none. So
I'm not going to belittle your reasons for coming strong to the faith. I don't want to do that. And I understand where you're coming from. In regards to linguistic miracles, it's true that we don't know Arabic. However, the meaning is still preserved in some fashion. For many people who cannot read Arabic, cannot understand it. For instance, when I received my first Quran in English, to me it was at first nothing remarkable, and then I got to what the ayah is, but it was talking about my mother, or about your mother, and how she raised you, how you were in her womb and treated her with respect and kindness, and that made me cry. And the reason it did is because in my culture, when you're 18 years old, you leave the house and you don't see your parents again. You maybe see them once or twice a year, and you disrespect your parents. It's pretty normal, and that really hurt to read that, because for me it was hard to stomach. I've never experienced that before. So in a way, I feel that the Quran can still speak to people regardless of whether they know Arabic or not. But it also makes you think, why, and I'm sorry to say this, not really actually, why the Arabs are so bad when they can understand the language and the meanings. And they say it every single day, and they hear it every single day, and yet they're killing each other, and they have the worst, everything. It's not even like, it's worse than backwards. And you wonder to yourself, these people are given the Quran, they have the language, and they can't even get the language right. Yani, you listen to Saudis and Egyptians, and it's like, oh Allah, please be quiet. The way they talk is like, wallahi, it's really bad. And I'm sorry to speak this, but they don't even speak the language of the Quran. They speak a bastardized form of Arabic. Okay, they do. And you think that they would preserve it. You know who are the most Hufaz are? Is it Hafiz, right? Yeah. The Quran are from India. Why? They speak Urdu. That's their mother tongue. Why are there more of them memorizing the Quran than the Arab world? What is going on? This is nonsense. As to your second point regarding the scientific things that you found in there, I would go back to what I said before, is that what you found to be miraculous is maybe that was Allah's way of bringing you in. But at the same time, I would say that, because Allah He'd bring anyone in anyway. At the same time though, I would be, like I said, still be very, very cautious, because when you read the Quran, it's very vague when it goes to physical. A lot of things you could really just see with the naked eye. It's not difficult. The Arabs were not just people who, they weren't just landlords, they also had ships. So about the water, they probably figured it out. Or there's so much trading going on in Mecca, they probably heard it from other people that came from different parts of the world. The Persians on the east, and you had the Byzantines from the north, they had a lot of knowledge as well. So we can't, remember the Prophet Muhammad he was a merchant himself. He traveled quite, he probably got a lot of information. I'm not saying he made up, don't get me wrong, he made up anything. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that he did, if you read the hadith, he had some knowledge himself about many things. Where did he get that? He may have been illiterate, but he heard some things. So he knew something. He was an intelligent man. For God's sakes, he was a great general. He could run a city. He knew how to run an economy. He knew how to do everything. And this was aside from the revelation that was given to him. So he was extremely intelligent. So he must have learned something. Again.
Until what point is it wrong to use science as a basis to believe in the Quran?
I would say that you can use science to the point that it's the most vague level. The Quran is not incorrect about anything scientifically, because the Quran does not talk anything complex about science. The Quran talks about only the most basic, fundamental things that you would understand from the physical world, that the Arabs would understand. So the Quran does not contradict science, but it also affirms science in the way that it allows you to explore beyond it. Imagine this, if the Quran had all these scientific miracles in there, like I said about the golden age of Islam, there'd be no point for them to look anywhere. They would have all the information. They discovered these things because the Quran liberated their minds. It allowed them to go beyond. It didn't, like the Bible tells you all this nonsense about what happened with the world and things like this, and the Christians had a dark age for a reason. Okay, so, but the Quran doesn't speak about science. It just tells you, discover the world. Look for the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what they did. And that's why they became, in the most quickest amount of time, the most powerful empire the world has ever known. That's okay. I'm good.
Do you like that the rise of atheism? We can see the honesty of these small groups. It's a threat to us. It means Central is the opposite of Islam is Muslim.
Let me correct. There is no opposite of fitra. Fitra is fitra. Everyone has fitra. Atheism is just a cognitive denial of what that is. It's like telling yourself, "I'm not hungry." You know, that's it's a very poor analogy, but it would be something akin to that.
So how do we go about actually protecting our family?
Protecting your family. Okay. The first thing that we should do as a Muslim community is that we should stop shying away from these topics. That's the first problem. Because our children are going on the internet and they're looking up these books, and they're all free online, by the way. You can just Google them and download the PDFs. They don't have to go buy them in the bookstore. And they're going to atheist forums, and they are engaging with these ideas on a daily basis. And they're engaging with other ideas too, like liberal Islam. They're engaging.
Can I correct you about the programs? I don't think it's for my kid, for my son, he's 10 years old.
Okay, sorry.
In an this discussion, not in a forum,
Okay.
but in an online game forum.
Okay.
So they are playing games and they are talking about.
Oh yeah, they happen everywhere. Yeah. You can be shooting somebody and talking about God. That's a lot harder. A lot harder. Stop So, and even in school they'll be engaged with this, because there'll be somebody in school that has this skeptical attitude. The thing is, we don't shy away from it. There's going to be people like that out there, and we need to engage them. And we need to talk about these subjects, and we need to clarify them. You know, there are a lot of things that are taboo in this society, and in actually many Muslim societies, not including different belief systems, but also like, I'm sorry to say this, like sex, for instance. That's a very big taboo subject, which is also very problematic for our youth who are engaging in sex at a much younger age nowadays. We need to stop having, we need to start having these sort of discussions. Our ulama in the past wrote volumes and volumes on every problem you can imagine, and they were not shy about it. And if we want to prevent something from happening, the first thing we need to do is spearhead it. We need to go in front of it first. We need to make sure that our children or our friends and family are already aware. And if we see signs of people talking about they have questions and doubts, we should entertain those doubts. We should talk about those doubts. We should try to get literature. We should this is the best way, because it's better to be engaged and knowledgeable about a subject than ignorant and then fall victim to it later.
Why the rise of atheism? I mean, what is the lure of atheism to the community nowadays?
There are many motivations, but first off, I already talked about there's this underlying understanding of science as being the most objective truth, and that's really the biggest persuasive factor. Now, the reason why people are turning away from religion has more to do with the fact that people are just jerks. And, somebody's looking for a way to rebel. I'm not trying to say that everything is necessarily pathological or psychological or anything like this, but the main motivator usually for leaving a religion has little to do with rationality, actually. It has more to do with moral principles. So, I mean, I'm not surprised that there are so many people going to atheism in Saudi Arabia, for instance. You want to say something?
Some of you may feel disappointed. You say, oh, so you can use science now. No, what are the miracles in the Quran? I don't understand Arabic. Then there's no scientific miracles. So what is there left for us? Brothers and sisters in Islam, there are so many other fields. There are so many other miraculous nature of the Quran. Let me give you a simple example. If you read Surah Al-Kahf, أَمْ حَسِبْتَ أَنَّ أَصْحَابَ الْكَهْفِ وَالرَّقِيمِ كَانُوا مِنْ آيَاتِنَا عَجَبًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about the dwellers of the cave, Ashab al-Kahf, and also Ar-Raqib. Not many people look at this word Ar-Raqib, but this is one of the most interesting subjects in history, in recent history. We know about the Ashab al-Kahf, those people who lived before the coming of Isa alayhi salam. Another name for them is the Essenes, E-S-S-E-N-E-S, or in Arabic we call them the Isawis, the people who are waiting for Isa alayhi salam. So they call themselves the Essenes. There are many, many evidence to show that the Ashab al-Kahf were the Essenes. They were waiting for Sayyidina Isa, and they were waiting for another prophet after Isa alayhi salam, which is Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. This is all recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Raqim is pointing to, I believe, after doing my research, it is pointing to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls were found near the Dead Sea. And if you read about the Ashab al-Kahf, they were the dwellers of the cave near the Dead Sea. And they are the ones who preserved the writings of the prophets before Isa alayhi salam, that speaks about Isa and speaks about Rasulullah sallallahu, and preserved it in their caves. And only recently, just 20, 30 years ago, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls affirms the Quran, affirms the Nubuwwah, the prophethood of Isa alayhi salam, and affirms the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So there are historical miracles also. So don't only focus on either linguistic miracles or scientific miracles. Now, even this, I would say, can be wrong. Even this can be wrong. But wrongness also has a limit. When you see it with your own eyes, and when they confess that these books were not discovered until recently, it even dated way before the Bible that we have. You see, they did their carbon dating and so on and so forth. So these are the things that can strengthen your iman also. So do not get demotivated. I was glad if there's a possibility. But it's good that he deconstructs this, so we think about it. So, any questions? If there is no question, can we move on with your thesis? Oh, there's a tea break.
Growing quite tired, so we shall continue the session with more questions and answers, and perhaps any other clarifications if necessary. I feel that there still is a lot to explain, but I leave it up to you because my brain is melting. So if there would like to be any more inquiries, perhaps?
Because just now I was speaking to someone.
Okay.
Yeah, the concern is this. We want to hear the response to atheism.
Response.
The response. How do you respond besides deconstructing scientism, all this? What are other arguments?
Oh, you want to get the other arguments?
The juicy part of
This is the juicy part. Okay, anyways, so to the less juicy parts. Atheists tend to have various other forms of arguments that they utilize whenever arguing against various religious beliefs. Particularly, atheists love to argue against Christians. Christians and atheists love each other, but they're always going at it like crazy. But atheists also, I think atheists are more scared of Muslims because they really don't know what we believe, and at the same time, it's easier just to say these people are crazy cave dwellers who blow themselves up. But whenever they do engage with Muslims, they tend to bring up atrocities in the name of religion, like, oh, why did these people slam planes into the towers? And that's just, I know some people here don't believe that didn't happen, okay, but I'm just saying, this is something they would bring up. Or why do people, go into a crowded market and shout Allahu Akbar and then blow themselves up? And then they usually blame the religion of Islam. It's a very fallacious form of reasoning. Whenever you say that's not Islam, the atheist will typically respond with, that's a no true Scotsman fallacy. What that means is that, in logic, that means is that the description given for a Muslim does not define this particular individual. It's fallacious. So if this person believes in Islam, this person believes in the Prophet Muhammad, this person believes in Allah, that means they're Muslim. So the atheist says, so this person was a Muslim. Okay, and then they blame Islam for that. A way to counter this is very simple. You just have to always tell the atheist that you have to differentiate between how people interpret things and what the ideal is. And that's typically the way you get around that. Very simple. To be honest, a lot of the things I'm going to tell you aren't going to work anyway, because they're not going to listen to you. I've had so many arguments with atheists over the years, and I can tell you one thing right now, the only thing I gained from it was a headache. And maybe some side information. Atheists will also propound this view called the default position, which is very similar to something we talked about earlier. They say, atheists have the default position. That means you have to prove your side of the story. We don't have a belief. You have a belief, so you have to prove to us that we're wrong, or that you're right. And they will say that everything requires evidence to be believed. And I've argued against this position before in many cases. In my bachelor's last research paper, I argued against this position. They will say, all beliefs require evidence to be believed. And then you ask them, does that belief require evidence to be believed? And then that's it. So that's all you have to say for that. Atheists typically will not use any other arguments, mostly just emotional arguments. They'll typically use ones about evil, about why does God do this, why does God punish people forever in hell, all these things like this. And honestly, there's no rational objections you can bring to the table. What you feel comfortable with, they're not going to feel comfortable with because they choose not to. That's just the bottom line. There's a passage in the Quran, once again I can't remember where it is, that says that even if the clouds came falling down on them, they wouldn't believe. They would just say, oh, the sky. I don't remember exactly what they would respond. But they would always attribute it to some natural cause because they've covered their hearts that way. All I have to tell you is that if you want to argue against atheists, don't go online and do it. Try to, really, what you want to do is try to convince your fellow Muslims to be wary of these sort of things. There's no point in arguing with these people online. They've already made up their minds. And if they really want Islam, they'll come to you. That's it. And same thing with Christians, same thing with Jews, everyone you can think of. This is just how human beings are. So I just stay away from arguments. Just stay away. So that easy. Anyone else? It's very quiet. Awkward moment. Okay.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your thesis.
About my thesis. Okay. In my thesis, I gave you a very concise presentation of what's actually in my thesis. In the thesis, I also talk about some of the traditional arguments for God's existence, like the teleological argument, the cosmological argument. I explained how they were used, why they were used. I explained that they were not used against atheists, necessarily. They were used against particular types of believers back then who had different views of Allah. So in fact, there are a lot of people today who use these traditional arguments for God's existence from the Islamic Kalam, like Kalam, cosmological argument, things like this. They use these arguments not knowing that they were actually used against philosophers who believed in God, but believed in a different conception of God. They weren't used against atheists. Actually, Muslim theologians very rarely dealt with atheists. Rarely. There's very little literature on atheist arguments, anti-atheist arguments in Islam. I also go into a survey of what evidentialism is. It's basically a philosophical belief that everything requires evidence. So I go into more detail about that before I go into scientism. In chapter 2, I talk about the history of scientism. So I start from Bertrand Russell. I talk about the concept of logism. Basically, he created, he was the first one to come up with the concept that logic is all mathematics is broken down to logical axioms, which is a precursor to Wittgenstein. And then I talk about Pragmatism a little bit more. I talk about the evolution of scientific philosophy. I talk about Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper. I don't know if you're familiar with Karl Popper, but he came up with the concept of falsifiability in science. I talk about that issue. In the third chapter, I discuss rebuttals, I introduce new arguments, and finally I introduce Sayyidnik Balatas in regards to fana and losing yourself, getting rid of the subjective ego. And this is really what I want to talk about next, and I've already touched on it a little bit, but I can't give you much information on this, but if you truly want to have some sort of objective knowledge of the reality that really is, okay, not the illusions in front of you, I suggest very bluntly that you join a tariqah, and you get a sheikh, and you let him guide you. And inshallah, you will find the way. And then you will have certainty. That much I can tell you. You will have certainty. You won't have just a rational understanding, you will have certainty. And if you want to bring people to the faith in the strongest manner possible, you will bring them with you on the same path. I'm telling you right now, nobody has ever been convinced with real conviction, with rationality. Very few people in this world.
I mean, I would say I have yaqeen, absolute certainty in the oneness of Allah. Why do I have to go through a tariqah? And I mean, my tariqah will be following the way of Rasulullah and the Sahabas.
Yeah. You have certainty, yeah, but there is a certainty of like certainty. There's certainty within the subjective world that we live in the realm that we have been placed in. This tank, this fish tank. I like to think of the world as a fish tank. That we all have these barriers here that we can't get past. And I like to think of the certainty beyond that as being outside the fish tank looking down. My sheikh, he would talk about it like this. He would say this Persian carpet here, well, we're like ants on the Persian carpet, and we think there's no blue, because we're only standing on the white part. But if we ascend that, we see the whole reality for what it is. And that's the absolute certainty. That's what it is. And there are various ways of practicing tasawwuf. I mean, you can practice. You can go to different tariqahs. You can practice in different forms. There's different ways of purifying the heart. Some of the ulama, or the Tarqawi tariqah, they used to. This sounds rather disgusting, I'm sorry, but they used to walk around with rags, and they would carry buckets of feces on their back and just walk around, and they would humble themselves that way in the presence of others. And of course they would do the necessary, prayers and things like this, but they would do it to humiliate themselves so that they would lose their ego quicker, so they would get rid of their nafs, so they wouldn't think so highly of themselves. And by doing that, they would become closer to Allah. And of course, in other ways, somebody would beg on the street. I'm not saying you have to do this. I'm just saying that these are just methods that some people used to do in order to come so close to Allah that they would release themselves from the world completely.
The Muslim has izzah, begging is dishonorable. Rasulullah said many hadith about the one who gives is better than the one who receives, and he frowned upon begging. So you're saying to me you found a way which is better than the way of Rasulullah?
No, I'm saying the intention is different.
That's the main thing. Then the second thing that my major beef in all these things is that you go and then you start doing the zikr circle and start and then going for the falak, then you forget everything around you. Then you become bunnies. You just want to think of yourself, you become bunnies. There are so many problems that are facing the ummah right now. Let's tackle them. There's the LGBT issue, there's the liberal Islam issue, there are people with murtad, all these things we forget. There are problems with mu'ez, this, that, everything we forget. We focus on the inner dimension of dunya and become bunnies. That's my main beef with all these things. Of course, I don't discount Sufism. I mean, you have great warriors like Imam Mukhtar who follow and stuff like that. The manifestation of Sufism here, unfortunately, leads one to become very decisive.
I understand what you're saying, and there are various Sufisms that have become esotericized. Basically, they internalize themselves to the point where they forget everything about the world around them. However, a true Sufi will take that moment, and I'm sorry to say true Sufi, I don't mean to be elitist in this regard, but will take that moment of self-extinction, bring themselves back to the world, and use it as their motivation for jihad. And that's just, it should be a balance at all times. I agree with you that there should never be this constant infusion into this personalized realm of things. And even outside of Sufism, we have the same thing in the once again, I hate using labels, but it's the easiest one to use, in this supposedly neo-Salafi, I don't know what you want to call it, movement, Al-Maghrib and Mercy Mission. They personalized the fiqh, they personalized the Islam so much, that the outside issues become almost trivial. I mean, how many times have you ever heard people talk about the caliphate? I don't hear about it at all. We have our own political system, we have our own economic system, you don't hear about it. You hear about how to have a good marriage. Wallah, you can go read a book about that. What do you have to go? So I think this happens on both sides. And I think there's a lot of issues that are not being discussed. But I think the Ummah also focuses on things that are also extremely trivial in regards to, for instance, and I'm probably going to be putting a target on my back right now, but the issue in Gaza. My opinion is very clear, and I'm going to say this regardless, because this is what I believe to be true. But I think the Sunnah is to leave and get out of that land instead of sacrificing your children every single day. There's a hadith, and if you please confirm for me, is that the blood of a Muslim is more precious than the Kaaba. Is that correct? The blood of a Muslim is more precious than the Kaaba, and yet you have Palestinians saying we have to stay there for Al-Aqsa. And Al-Aqsa is lesser than the... So what is this? It's not even, you hear about them fighting all the time, but a lot of it is nationalism. So many children are dying there every single day. For God's sake, leave. It's not worth it. It's a piece of dirt. It's not worth it, I'm sorry. And I have a very controversial opinion in that regard. I have a lot of Muslims that don't like me for saying that, but too many people have died. Let the Jews have it. We're getting it back in the end. Wallah. And we're going to take out every single one of them, trust me. So why now? Why do we have to fight now? It's a massacre. Sorry.
Agree with you, Ustaz.
Anyways, that's not on topic. So.
Just digress a bit and talk a little bit about philosophy of religion.
Certainly. Yes.
Now, the god dilemma, I don't know how you pronounce the Greek. It starts E-U-T-H. How do you pronounce that?
Euthyphro.
Yeah. What's the Islamic response to that? Can you point me to any literature of that, please?
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers in the Quran very clearly. When the angels say, why are you creating man? There's going to be much bloodshed. He says, I know what you do not. Allah creates both good and evil. We accept. Allah is not evil, but at the same time He's not good. He's beyond both of those concepts. Good and evil are relative to us. Everything to Him is more than that. Is that okay? Show me. None of the sisters are going to talk to you. Very shy. Oh, yes. I have several. The first one was Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. That was the first one. That is, like I said, it's very dry reading, but if you can get through, if you like history, I think you'll enjoy it. And it's quite fascinating. His arguments are very interesting there. It's very revealing. If you want to know about the new atheism It's a book called The New Atheism by Victor Stenger. It's very anti-religious, so don't mind when you read it, but he explains a lot of the beliefs of the new atheist. He even claims in the book himself that they're not science, they don't follow scientism, but at the same time he contradicts himself. You'll find it in there. What else? I actually have a reading list here. If you want, when I send you the thesis, I can give you, there's a literature review and a bibliography on the back. You can just read all that and you get all the books.
So do not forget to give your email. We will send you the thesis.
And by the way, it's not my best written work. There's lots of errors in there, but the general information is there. I'm restructuring it for publication later, so just take it as it is. Cosmological argument basically just says that there was a beginning to the universe and the beginning is a creator. It's a very weak argument, actually. It's based on Aristotelian philosophy, metaphysics. And a famous Christian theologian and philosopher by the name of William Lane Craig tends to use the Kalam cosmological argument quite a lot. He thinks it's a solid proof for the existence of God. I think it's not. You can look him up on YouTube. He has several presentations of that argument on there. His name is William Lane Craig. But I don't think it's very convincing at all. It argues for a deistic God, but that's about it. The teleological argument is basically the design argument. You know, the world looks designed, therefore there must be a designer. Things like this. I don't think that's a very strong argument either, because I don't really think it works on believers. It's something that you kind of already affirm. For a non-believer, it's not gonna, work at all. But most objections to the design argument are evolutionary theory. I would just use the objection I gave you earlier, is that evolution is not a simple process. It's a very complex process. It requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of information in order to get started. So if people want to argue from a single cell, everything came into being, then they need to argue where all of that came from prior that made it possible. So I think it's the best objection you can use in that regard. And yeah, I think it's getting kind of dry.
So we started at 2:30 just now.
Oh yeah,
It's up to you. You want to end early for Ramadan?
they existed. Tell us.
Before Adam or after Adam?
If I want to give you the safe answer, I'd say I don't know. So I just know that they're there. I don't. If you really.
So it fits into the evolution theory, right?
I don't think it really disrupts anything either way.
No, but it fits the evolution theory.
Not really. The surviving dinosaurs that we have today are birds. Yeah, because most dinosaurs were actually not those large, massive things. They were actually no smaller than a rat. So most of the dinosaurs, actually, they just recently discovered a lot of the ancient, you've seen Jurassic Park, right? They discovered a lot of those ancient dinosaurs didn't actually have scaly skin, they actually had feathers. So, in fact, most of the surviving dinosaurs are pigeons outside. So, it doesn't mean that they became birds, they were already kind of there. So.